The morning Harlan Briggs rode up to the Holloway gate, he didn't bother to dismount. He just looked down at her from his horse, 24 years old, dressed still carrying the dust from her husband's burial, and laughed. Not a quiet laugh, the kind that carried across a yard, the kind that was meant to. "Sell it to me now," he said, "or I'll watch you starve off it by winter and buy it for half." Maris Holloway looked up at him. Her hands were empty. Her account held $40. Behind her, the hillside was cracked and bare, and everyone in Caldwell Crossing agreed it wasn't worth the paper the deed was printed on. She didn't answer him. She turned around, walked back inside, and made the most reckless decision of her life. If this story moves you, if you've ever been told your dream wasn't worth a dime, hit that subscribe button right now. Ring the bell. Drop your city and country in the comments below because I want to see how far this story travels. And don't you dare leave before the end, because what happens on that hillside? Nobody saw it coming. The funeral cost more than they had. That was the first thing Maris understood when she sat down at the kitchen table the night after they buried Edmund Holloway, spread out every piece of paper she could find, and tried to make the numbers say something different than what they said. They didn't. Edmund had been sick for 14 months. 14 months of doctors who charged too much and cures that didn't work, and a stubborn man who kept saying he'd be fine in the spring. He wasn't fine in the spring. He died on a Thursday in October, 3 weeks before his 31st birthday, and he left behind a hillside property with 72 acres of rocky, drought-prone land, a mortgage with the Caldwell Crossing Savings and Trust that was 4 payments behind, and a wife who had spent the last year learning more about laudanum dosages than she ever wanted to know. Maris was 24. She hadn't told anyone about the money. People in small towns have a way of finding out, and she didn't want their pity any more than she wanted their advice. What she had was $40.11 in a tin box under the floorboard, a milk cow that was getting old, 3 laying hens, and 72 acres that the entire Caldwell Crossing community had spent years telling Edmund he'd been a fool to buy. Rocky ground, they said. Nothing holds up there. Wind strips it, sun bakes it. You can't run cattle on it. Their hooves can't take the terrain. You can't plow it. The soil's too thin. It's hill country that doesn't want to be farmed. Edmund had believed he could change it. He hadn't, and now it was hers. She sat at the table until the candle burned low, and she did not cry. She had done her crying in the 2 weeks before he died, when she still let herself hope. After the hope ran out, the crying ran out with it. What was left behind was something harder and quieter, something she didn't have a name for yet. She folded up the papers. She put the tin box back under the board. She went to bed. In the morning, she went to town. No, the feed store was the center of Caldwell Crossing, in the way that feed stores always are in small frontier towns. Part supply depot, part social institution, where men gathered to talk about weather and prices and other people's poor decisions. When Maris Holloway walked in that Tuesday morning, there were 4 men already there. Dale Pruckett, who ran cattle on 300 flat acres south of town, his brother-in-law Roy Fenwick, a younger man named Cecil Bright, who nobody took seriously, and Harlan Briggs, who everyone took too seriously. Harlan Briggs was 46 years old and owned more land in the Caldwell Crossing Valley than any other single person. He had started with money and made more of it, which people sometimes confused with intelligence. He had an opinion about everything and the social weight to make sure other people heard it. He had come to Edmund's funeral, stood in the back, and left before the reception. He noticed Maris the moment she walked in. His expression didn't change much, but his posture did. A small settling, like a man who has just seen something that confirms what he already thought. "Mrs. Holloway," Dale Pruckett said. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Mr. Pruckett." She nodded at them collectively. "I'm looking to make a purchase." "We got a good lot of leghorn pullets just came in," Roy Fenwick offered. "Young hens, good layers. That's what most widows start with, something manageable. I'm not interested in chickens." A pause. The particular silence of men recalibrating. "What are you interested in?" Harlan Briggs said. She had rehearsed this, not the words exactly, but the tone. Steady, not asking for approval, not inviting debate. I heard Silas Greer is selling off his goat herd. The silence changed quality. Then Cecil Bright, who nobody took seriously, did the thing that got him laughed at regularly. He laughed first, before the others were ready. A short surprise sound. "Silas's herd?" Dale Pruckett said. "That's right. Mrs. Holloway, those animals are in terrible shape. Silas hasn't been able to feed them proper for 2 years now. He's been trying to sell them off, but nobody wants them. Half of them are underweight, some of them are sick, the whole herd. How many does he have left?" Pruckett exchanged a look with Roy Fenwick. "Last I heard, 50-some. 55, Harlan Briggs said. He was watching her the way a man watches a chess piece he hasn't decided what to do with yet. "He's asking $40 for the lot. Nobody's biting. They're not worth $40. "Then it should be a straightforward negotiation," Maris said. She bought 40 cents worth of tobacco twists because her father-in-law liked them, and she owed him a visit. And she walked back out into the morning sun, and she did not look behind her to see what their faces were doing. She could imagine it fine. Silas Greer's place was 4 miles north, on the far edge of the valley, where the flat ground started rising into the first real slopes of the hill country. He met her at the fence line, a worn-out man in his late 60s who looked like the last 2 years had used him hard. "You the Holloway widow?" he said. "I am." He studied her for a moment. He was the kind of man who took his time about things, not out of stubbornness, but out of the habit of being careful. "You know what you're looking at here." "I know they're thin," she said. "I know they've had a rough time. I know you need to sell them." "I know I need to sell them," he agreed, "but I'd rather sell them to someone who isn't going to make them suffer worse. Harlan Briggs offered me $20 last month. I turned him down. Man would have run them into the ground and sold the meat. I'm not interested in their meat. What are you interested in?" It was the second time she'd been asked that question today. She'd had more time to think about the answer this time, or maybe it was that Silas Greer looked like he actually wanted to know. "I've got 72 acres of hill country that everyone says is useless," she said. "Rocky ground, thin soil, bad for cattle, bad for crops. Everybody's been telling me that for years. But goats don't need what cattle need. They don't need flat ground or deep soil. They do better in rough terrain than anywhere else. I think my land might actually be right for them, and I think if I can get them healthy and keep them healthy, there might be a business in it." Silas Greer was quiet for a long moment, looking at her with an expression that wasn't quite skepticism and wasn't quite belief. Something in between, cautious and considering. "What do you know about goats?" he said. "Almost nothing," she said honestly. "That's my biggest problem." Something shifted in his face. The honesty landed differently than confidence would have. He pushed his hat back and looked out at the hillside where his herd was scattered, bony and listless and small against the slope. $40, he said. $40, she said. "Every cent I have." He held out his hand. She shook it. She drove them up to the Holloway land herself, on foot, a woman alone with 55 half-starved goats and a borrowed dog named Bucket, who was enthusiastic but largely ineffective. It took most of the day. 3 of the animals were too weak to move well, and she had to half-carry them the last mile, one at a time, going back and forth on the slope while the dog circled anxiously and accomplished very little. By the time she got the last one through the gate, the sun was gone, and her arms felt like they'd been pulled from the sockets, and she was so tired she sat down on the ground right there, in the dark, with goats bumping against her legs, and thought, "I have just made a catastrophic mistake." Then one of the smaller ones, a young doe, ribs showing, one ear slightly torn, walked directly up to her, stuck its nose against her cheek, and exhaled warmly. She almost laughed. It wasn't funny, exactly, but there was something in it. She got up. She went inside. She made a list of everything she didn't know, which was extensive, and set it on the table where she'd see it first thing in the morning. The story was all over Caldwell Crossing by Thursday. Maris didn't hear it directly. Nobody was going to walk up to a widow and say the things to her face that they were saying in the feed store and at the Sunday social and across the fence lines of the valley. But she heard enough, secondhand and sideways, to understand the shape of it. She spent her last dollar on a herd of sick goats. Harlan was right. That land can't support anything. Poor thing, she's not thinking straight. Grief does that. She'll be selling to Briggs by spring. The one that stung most wasn't about the goats. It was the word poor. Not poor as in without money, though that was true enough. Poor as in pitiful. Poor as in to be felt sorry for. Poor as in her opinion on her own life didn't quite count because she was in no position to be making decisions. She heard it once, through an open window at the general store, a woman's voice she recognized but wasn't going to name. Poor Maris Holloway. Edmund could barely make a go of it with good sense, and now she's out there alone with those wretched goats. I feel terrible for her. The feeling terrible for her was almost worse than the laughing. She bought her flour and her salt, and she walked back out. It was the following week, a Thursday afternoon with a cold wind coming off the upper hills, when she met Gregor Varga. She had been up on the north slope trying to figure out why two of the goats kept returning to the same patch of scrubby ground and ignoring the better browse she'd identified on the eastern side. She'd been watching them for 20 minutes, crouched behind a boulder, trying to understand their logic, when a voice behind her said, in a thick accent she couldn't immediately place, "They smell something under the rock." She spun around. He was standing about 10 feet away. An old man, past 70 certainly, built solid despite his age, with white hair and a face that had spent decades outdoors. He was watching the goats, not her, with the particular attention of someone who had looked at animals for a very long time. "I didn't hear you come up," she said. "Old man, slow feet. You were watching too hard to notice." He nodded toward the goats. "They are not stupid, these two. They follow something. You cannot see what yet, but they know." "Who are you?" "Gregor Varga. My land is the other side of that ridge. 30 acres, been mine 30 years. He finally looked at her. His eyes were a pale, washed-out gray, the kind of eyes that had seen a lot of weather. "Your husband, Edmund Holloway. Good man. I was sorry to hear." She didn't say anything for a moment. The goats moved, drifting toward the scrub again. "You know goats?" she said. "In Hungary, where I came from, my family kept goats 4 generations. Goats in the mountains, goats in the valleys. I know goats the way some men know horses." He paused. "I heard what you did. Buying Silas Greer's herd. People in town think you are—" He searched for the word politely. "Not well advised." "I know what people in town think. Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you think?" She looked out over the slope. The thin soil, the rocky outcroppings, the poor scrubby vegetation that had defeated everything Edmund had tried to grow. She looked at the 55 goats scattered across it, still thin, still rough, but moving, alive. Already beginning, in ways she couldn't fully measure, to look less like they were dying. "I think," she said slowly, "that this land was always going to be hard for what people wanted to do with it. But maybe it doesn't want to be what people wanted it to be." She stopped, feeling like she'd said something that sounded foolish. "That probably doesn't make sense." "It makes perfect sense," Gregor Varga said. He looked at the hillside with something she could only describe as recognition. "Land has a nature. You cannot fight it. You work with what it is." He was quiet again, then, "You need to learn how to manage the rotation, and you need to learn something about making cheese." She looked at him. "Cheese. Goat cheese. Good market for it, if it is good cheese. I made it with my wife for 15 years. We sold to a grocer in the city, 40 miles. Not a big business, but real." He glanced at her sideways, something almost careful in it. "I am old. I have no one to teach. If you are willing to learn from a stubborn old Hungarian, I am willing to teach." She had $40 in total wealth that morning, and now she had 0. And she was standing on a hillside that everyone in town thought was going to kill her, and an old man she'd met 4 minutes ago was offering to teach her something she'd never done. She had spent the last year watching every safe thing fall apart anyway. "When do we start?" she said. "Baba." Harlan Briggs came back the following Monday. He didn't ride up to the gate this time. He rode all the way up the track to the house, which was a different kind of statement, less casual, more deliberate. He had a man with him she didn't recognize, younger, in a coat that was too good for the country. She was out front splitting wood when they arrived. She kept splitting while he dismounted. "Mrs. Holloway." He looked at the goats visible on the slope above. His expression was the kind a man wears when he is trying to look neutral and doesn't quite manage it. I wanted to make you an offer. You made me an offer last week. A different offer, a better one. He named a figure, not enormous, but more than the land was worth by any standard measure, more than she would get on the open market for a rocky hillside with a failing mortgage. That's fair market value, and then some. You could pay off what you owe Edmund's bank, have money left over to start again somewhere with better prospects. The man in the good coat was looking at the slope, not at the goats, at the ground. What's your friend looking at? She said. Briggs didn't miss a beat. Business associate. I like to have someone look things over before I invest. He's not looking at the house. He's not looking at the fencing. He's looking at the north slope. She set the axe down on the block. That's an interesting place to look on a piece of ground you're calling below average. Something moved behind Briggs's eyes, fast and then controlled. I invest based on potential, not current condition. That's business. Then you ought to understand when I tell you I see potential too, she said, and I'm not selling. He looked at her for a long moment. Men like Harlan Briggs are not accustomed to the word no, and when they hear it, there is always a moment where you can see them deciding how seriously to take it. You're going to lose this place to the bank, he said. When you do, you won't be able to negotiate. You'll take what you're given. Maybe, she said, but not today. He rode away without another word. The man in the good coat took one last look at the north slope before he turned his horse around. Maris stood in the yard and watched them go and felt, beneath the steadiness she'd been holding all week, a thin, cold thread of fear running through her chest. She didn't know what he knew, but she knew now that he knew something, and that changed everything. Obashan. That night she sat at the kitchen table again. The same table, the same tin box empty now, the same papers that still said what they said. But she wrote something different this time. Not a list of debts, a list of questions. Why does Briggs want the North Slope specifically? What does his man know about geology or water? What are the goats smelling under that rock? What did Gregor mean when he said the land has a nature? She didn't have answers. She had 55 goats, an old Hungarian neighbor, and a set of questions that were going to take longer than she had to answer. She folded the paper. She went to bed. Outside on the hillside, the goats moved quietly in the dark, following something she couldn't see yet, back toward the same patch of scrubby ground on the north slope, the same low spot between the boulders, the same earth that Harlan Briggs's man had stood and stared at without saying a word. They had not gotten there by accident, but Maris Holloway did not know that yet. Part 2. Turning worthless land into hope. The questions on that folded piece of paper stayed on the table for 3 days before Maris touched them again. Not because she forgot them, because the goats didn't care about her questions. They needed feeding, rotating, watching, and 2 of the weakest ones needed more attention than the rest combined. The young doe with the torn ear, the one who had pressed her nose against Maris's cheek that first night, had developed a cough that worried her. Not a wet cough, not the kind that meant pneumonia, but persistent enough that Maris found herself checking on her twice in the night, crouching in the dark with a lantern, watching the animal's sides rise and fall. She named her Penny. She didn't mean to. It just happened one morning when she was talking to herself the way people do when they're alone too much, and she said, come on, Penny, eat something. And the name stuck like names do when they're right. Gregor Varga came on Wednesday with a cloth bag over his shoulder and the unhurried manner of a man who has decided something and doesn't need to announce it. He walked the upper pasture with her for an hour without saying much, just watching the herd move, occasionally crouching to look at the ground or a particular animal's feet, or the way one of the older does was holding her weight. How many you lose so far? He said finally. None. He looked at her sideways. None? I've been watching them around the clock. The 2 weakest ones, she pointed. They've been touch and go, but they're still here. He was quiet for a moment, recalibrating something. Most people buying a herd in that condition, they lose 3, 4 in the first 2 weeks, just the stress of moving them. I didn't give them a choice about surviving, she said. I just kept showing up. Gregor made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in that direction. He set his bag down on a flat rock and opened it. Inside, a small round of pale cheese wrapped in cloth, a knife, a piece of paper covered in handwriting too cramped to read from a distance. "First lesson," he said. "Taste this." She took the piece he cut and put it in her mouth. It was sharp, clean, slightly tangy in a way that sat at the back of her throat, nothing like the bland block cheese from the general store. There was something almost mineral in it, something that tasted like the outdoors. "That's from your goats?" she said. "From goats like yours. Mountain goats, rough terrain goats. The browse they eat, the different plants, the variety, it comes through in the milk. Flat pasture goats, corn-fed goats, they make flat-tasting milk. Your goats up here on this hillside eating 20 different things, their milk will have character." He said the word character the way people say it when they mean something important. Character is what you can sell. She looked at the herd scattered across the slope, still thin, still rough around the edges, and tried to see what he was seeing. It wasn't easy yet. "How long before I can start making cheese?" "You need milk first. You need your does settled, healthy, properly fed. Spring, maybe, if the winter doesn't take too many." He paused. "And you need to learn to make it right. Bad cheese is worse than no cheese. Bad cheese, people remember." "Then teach me to make it right." He picked up his bag. "That's why I brought the paper." The paper turned out to be 4 pages, dense with notes in a mix of English and what she assumed was Hungarian, covering everything from the temperature at which milk should be warmed to the specific aging conditions that produced the sharp, clean flavor she'd just tasted. Gregor had written it for himself, years ago, trying to preserve something his mother had taught him. He'd never shown it to anyone. He didn't make a ceremony of giving it to her. He just left it on the kitchen table when he went home that evening, and she stayed up half the night reading it. Some of it she could follow. Some of it required him to explain the next time he came. He came 3 times that first week, then twice the week after, and then, without either of them deciding it formally, he was simply there most mornings, arriving around 7, leaving before dark. He brought tools she didn't have. He fixed the fence line on the east side that Edmund had never gotten to. He showed her how to read the pasture rotation, how long to leave the goats in one section before moving them, how to let the land rest and recover so the browse came back stronger. He taught her things nobody in Caldwell Crossing had ever thought to ask him. 40 years of knowledge that had sat in his head unused since his wife died, since his children moved east, since he'd become just the old Hungarian on the other side of the ridge that people nodded at politely and didn't talk to. He wasn't easy about it either. He corrected her constantly, sometimes sharply. When she rotated the herd too early one morning because she was tired and wanted to be done, he made her bring them back. "You don't rotate for your convenience," he said. "You rotate for the land. You start rotating for your convenience, you overgraze, you lose the browse, and then you've got nothing." "I know," she said, more defensive than she meant to be. "Then act like you know." She wanted to say something sharp back. She bit it down. He was right, and she was aware enough of how much she didn't know to stay humble about it, even when it stung. But there were moments, not many, but real, when she got something right without being told, when she moved the herd or read the weather or noticed something in one of the animals before Gregor saw it, and he'd go quiet in a particular way. Not praise, just the absence of correction, which from Gregor Varga was worth quite a lot. The first snow came in late November, earlier than usual, and it was heavier than anyone expected. Maris had gotten the herd down from the upper pasture 2 days before, moved them into the lower shelter she and Gregor had spent 3 weeks reinforcing. She'd read the sky right, something about the color of it, the way the wind died too early, and acted on it without waiting for confirmation. When the snow came down hard for 2 days straight, the goats were dry and together, and she lost none of them. Dale Pruckett lost 11 cattle to exposure. Roy Fenwick's barn roof partially collapsed under the weight of it, taking 2 of his horses with it, not dead, but injured badly enough to cost him. Harlan Briggs, whose operation was large enough to absorb losses, absorbed them and said nothing publicly, which was its own kind of message. When the snow cleared and she rode into Caldwell Crossing for supplies, the mood was different from what she'd left. The kind of tight, subdued quiet that settles over a community after weather has reminded them that it is in charge, and they are not. Men stood in front of the feed store talking in lower voices than usual. A woman at the dry goods counter was doing the arithmetic of what a rough winter was going to mean for a tight spring. Nobody said anything directly to Maris, but she caught the glance between Dale Pruckett and his brother-in-law when she came in. A quick look, recalibrating. She'd moved her herd before the storm. She hadn't lost anything. Whether they'd admit it or not, they'd noticed. She bought her supplies and left without lingering. Bumped. What she didn't expect was Cecil Bright. He caught her at the wagon, the young man nobody took seriously, hands in his coat pockets, looking like he was working up to something. "Mrs. Holloway." He stopped about 5 feet away, which was the distance of a man who wasn't sure of his welcome. "I heard you got your herd in before the storm." "I did." "I lost 4 sheep," he said. "Not a big flock to begin with." He was quiet for a moment. "How'd you know it was coming that early? Everybody else thought we had another 3 days. She considered him. Cecil Bright was 22, maybe 23, and he had the particular look of a young man who had been underestimated enough times that it had become a kind of permanent uncertainty about himself. Not stupidity, but the damage that comes from people treating you like you're stupid for long enough. "The color of the sky 2 days out," she said, "and the wind dropped too early. Afternoon wind in November doesn't just stop unless something bigger's coming in." He nodded slowly, processing this. "Gregor Varga teach you that?" Some of it. Some of it I just watched. People say you two are up there all day working." "People say a lot of things." He almost smiled. "Yeah, they do." He shifted his weight, still not quite comfortable. "I just wanted to say, I don't think you made a mistake with those goats. I didn't say anything at the time because—" He stopped, honest enough to finish the sentence honestly. "Because I didn't want to be the only one not laughing, I guess." She looked at him. It was a strange thing to admit, stranger to her that he'd admitted it at all. "I appreciate that," she said. She didn't tell him it was fine because it wasn't entirely, but she didn't hold it against him either. She understood, more than she wanted to, the calculation he was describing. She drove home with her supplies and thought about that for a long time. Winter was the hardest stretch, and not just because of the cold. The bank sent a letter in January, formal, precisely worded, the kind of language that is designed to sound neutral while delivering something that isn't. She was now 5 payments behind on the mortgage. The bank understood her circumstances were difficult. The bank wished to remind her that the property was subject to foreclosure proceedings if the arrears were not addressed within 90 days. 90 days. She sat with that letter for a long time. She did the arithmetic 6 different ways and got the same answer each time. She didn't have it. The cheese operation wouldn't produce sellable product until spring at the earliest. The goats were healthier, but not producing enough milk yet to matter commercially. Her savings were gone. The cow's milk was keeping her fed, but not generating income. She folded the letter and put it with the papers on the table and didn't say anything to Gregor about it. That was probably a mistake, but she wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Saying it out loud made it more real, and she needed a few more days of it being slightly unreal. What she did instead was work harder, which was the only lever she had. She started keeping more detailed records, which does were producing the most milk, which sections of the pasture recovered fastest after rotation, what the goats were eating on the north slope versus the south slope, and whether it affected the milk. She filled 2 notebooks through January, and it was in the filling of those notebooks that she started to see something that surprised her. The north slope. The goats consistently produced richer milk, higher fat content, she could tell from the cream line, after days spent on the north slope. The browse up there wasn't obviously better than elsewhere. If anything, it was sparser, drier, harder going for the animals. But the milk was different, consistently, measurably. And they kept going back to that same low spot between the boulders. She mentioned it to Gregor on a Wednesday morning in February, casually, the way you mention something when you're not sure if it's worth mentioning. He didn't answer right away. He looked at her with that pale gray gaze of his, then looked up toward the north slope, then back at her. "Show me," he said. They climbed up together, Gregor moving slower than she was used to seeing him, his breath making clouds in the cold air. He didn't say anything on the way up. When they reached the low spot, a depression between 2 large outcroppings, the ground there darker than surrounding soil, the scrubby vegetation slightly different in character, a bit greener even in February, He crouched down. He pulled off his glove and pressed his palm flat to the ground. He stayed like that for almost a minute. "The ground is warmer here," he said. "Is it?" He looked up at her. "Come down here." She crouched beside him and put her own hand flat on the soil. It was subtle, not dramatically warmer, not like touching something heated, but different from the frozen hardpack a few feet away. A slight, persistent warmth. "What does that mean?" she said. "Could be nothing," Gregor said. "Could be thermal. Some rock formations hold heat differently." He paused. "But goats in the old country, in Hungary, they had an instinct for water. Underground water, springs, places where water moved under the surface. Warmer ground sometimes means water close. Water moving." He stood up slowly, one knee at a time. "My grandfather used to say, 'Follow the goats long enough, and they'll show you what the land knows.'" She looked at the spot. She looked at where Harlan Briggs's man had stood, staring at exactly this section of the slope. The cold, thin thread of fear from that Monday 2 months ago ran through her again, sharper this time. "Gregor," she said, "what would water mean? Underground water on a hillside like this?" He looked at her steadily. "It would mean quite a lot," he said. "In dry years. In drought years." A pause. "It would mean your land is not what anyone thinks it is." She stood there in the February cold with her hand still warm from the ground and thought about a man in a coat too good for the country, standing in this exact spot, not saying a word. Harlan Briggs had known, or suspected, long enough ago that he'd brought someone to look. The offer he'd made her, more than fair market value for worthless hill country, suddenly made a different kind of sense. She straightened up. "I need to find out what's down there," she said. Finding out was not simple, and nothing about the next 6 weeks was clean or easy. Gregor knew an old man named Piotr, another immigrant from the eastern part of the continent, who had spent 20 years as a water diviner. A practice that Maris didn't entirely believe in, but Gregor said was less about mysticism and more about reading land the way a doctor reads a body. Piotr was 81 and nearly deaf, and charged $3 for a consultation, which was $3 Maris didn't have. She bartered him 2 months of goat milk and the promise of the first round of cheese when it was ready, and he came up the hillside on a Thursday afternoon with a forked branch of willow and the patience of a man who had stopped being in a hurry about anything. He walked the slope for 2 hours. The willow branch did things she still wasn't sure she believed. But he ended up standing in the same low spot between the boulders, and he was absolutely certain about it. "Deep," he said in his heavily accented English, "but not so deep. Maybe 20 feet, maybe a little more. Good pressure. Moving water, not still water." He looked at the ground with a kind of reverence. Clean, from the mountain above, filtered through the rock a long time. He looked at Maris. "You have a spring under here, very old. Probably been here 1,000 years and nobody found it." She stood very still. "How do I get to it?" "You dig," he said, "or you find where the pressure wants to come up. Sometimes there's a natural weakness in the rock. You clear what's above it, and it opens itself." She spent the next 3 weeks on that slope with a pickaxe and a determination that she recognized, even at the time, as somewhat unreasonable. Gregor helped when she let him, which wasn't always. He was in his 70s and the work was hard, and she felt guilty for it. Cecil Bright showed up one morning without being asked, said nothing about why he was there, and picked up a shovel. She didn't turn him away. The bank's 90-day deadline was closing in. She had 60 days when they started digging, then 45, then 30. At 28 days left, one of the large flat rocks shifted under Cecile's shovel, and water came up through the crack. Not a trickle, not a seep. A steady, cold, clear upwelling that spread across the surface of the depression and ran downhill and didn't stop. Cecil dropped his shovel. He stood there with water running over his boots, staring down. "Lord," he said. Maris stood on the other side of the crack, water soaking the hem of her skirt, and felt something she didn't have language for. Not triumph, not quite, because she was still $30,000 short on her mortgage, and the spring hadn't solved that yet. But something shifted in her chest, something that had been clenched tight since the night she'd spread those papers on the table after Edmund's funeral and tried to make the numbers say something different. The land had been holding this the whole time. Everyone who had called it worthless had been looking at it with the wrong eyes. She went to the bank the following Monday. She had not told anyone about the spring yet except Gregor and Cecil, and she'd asked both of them to say nothing. Not because she was ashamed, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood, in a way she couldn't have explained a year ago, that information was its own kind of currency, and she hadn't decided how to spend it yet. The bank manager was a man named Theodore Alcott, 50-ish, careful, the kind of man who treated debt the way a doctor treats a diagnosis, with regret, but without apology. He had a letter ready on his desk when she came in, which told her he'd expected the meeting to go a certain way. She sat down across from him and put her own paper on his desk instead. "I need 90 days more," she said. "I have a significant asset development on the property that will change its assessed value substantially. I can get you a promissory note and a proper survey if you'll give me the time." Alcott looked at the paper, then at her. He was the kind of man who rarely showed his hand. "What sort of asset development?" "A water source," she said. "Underground spring. Active and confirmed." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him process it. Watched the careful banker's calculation move behind his eyes. Skepticism, interest, the question of whether this was real or the story of a desperate woman. "That's a significant claim for hill country property," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." "Who confirmed it?" "I'll have a surveyor's report within 30 days. And in the meantime, you want 90 days. 60, she said. She'd thought about this. Asking for less than she wanted sometimes worked better than asking for exactly what she needed. "Give me 60 days. He looked at her for a long moment. "You understand I have no obligation. I understand you'd rather have a performing loan than a foreclosure proceeding," she said. "We both know what hill country property sells for at auction. You'd recover 30 cents on the dollar if that." His mouth tightened slightly. She'd said something true that he didn't appreciate her knowing. 60 days, he said finally. "I'll need that surveyor's report." She walked out of the bank and stood on the wooden sidewalk in the thin March sunlight and breathed slow and deliberate until her hands stopped shaking. 60 days. But spring came fast that year, too fast in some ways, the warm weather arriving in a rush that left farmers scrambling. But on the Holloway hillside, fast spring meant the browse came back early and strong, and the does, healthy now in a way they hadn't been when she'd bought them, came into milk with a richness that made Gregor raise his eyebrows when he ran his first small test batch. "This is good," he said, turning the small curd over in his hands. This is good milk." She tried not to read too much into that. He'd corrected her relentlessly for 6 months, and she'd learned not to trust easy praise from him. But he made the first proper batch himself, walked her through every step at the actual pace it happened, not condensed, not summarized, and at the end of the first day of aging, he was already talking about yield and flavor profile and a grocer he knew in the city 40 miles east. The goats were 48 now. She'd lost 7 over the winter, less than Gregor had thought possible, but still 7, and she'd spent a hard few nights on each one before it went. She didn't let herself get detached about it. That was a lesson nobody taught her. Some of the animals she'd pulled back from the edge twice and lost them on the 3rd time, and that was the kind of thing that settled into you differently than you expected. But 48 goats in spring health were different from 55 starving goats in October. 48 healthy does, producing good milk on rough browse that gave the milk its character, with a man who'd been making cheese for 50 years standing in her kitchen. That was the beginning of something real. She sold her first rounds in April, not to the general store in Caldwell Crossing. She had thought about that, decided against it. She wrote a letter to the grocer in the city that Gregor had mentioned, described the product and the process, and asked if he'd be willing to take a trial shipment. She packed 8 rounds in cloth and straw and sent them east on the Thursday supply wagon with a handwritten note explaining how they should be stored and at what stage of aging they'd be at peak flavor. The grocer wrote back in 10 days. He wanted everything she could make at a price per pound that made her read the letter twice. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table, the same place where she'd done all her worst arithmetic, and read it a third time. She put it face down and sat there for a while, breathing. Then she turned it back over and read the number again, because she wanted to be sure. She paid the first installment on the mortgage in May, 2 weeks before the 60 days were up. She paid enough to bring the account current, not just to chip away at it. Theodore Alcott received the payment and sent her a receipt with a note that said, "In the precise, careful language of a banker who doesn't know how to admit he underestimated someone. The promissory terms have been fulfilled. The bank looks forward to a continued relationship." She didn't frame it. She put it in the tin box where the money used to be. It was around this time that she understood something about the town's awareness of her. Not the gossip, but the subtler thing beneath it. The way people had talked about her in October had been about pity and disaster. The way they talked about her now was different, quieter. She'd hear it in secondhand fragments, the way she always did. "That Holloway woman has some kind of operation going up there, and I heard she found water on that hillside, and Gregor Varga, of all people, apparently knows what he's doing with cheese." Nobody came and said directly, "We were wrong." People rarely did in Maris's experience. What they did instead was find smaller ways to acknowledge reality. A nod that lasted a beat longer, a question that assumed competence instead of its absence, a slight adjustment in how they stood when they talked to her. Harlan Briggs did none of these things. He sent a man to her property in late May, not himself, someone she didn't recognize, who walked the fence line on the roadside and didn't come up the track. She watched him from the upper pasture. He stood at the gate for a while, looking at the slope, then drove away. 3 days later, she found a notice from the county land office tacked to her gate post. It was a survey request, formally lodged, asserting that the boundary line between Holloway property and adjacent parcels might be incorrectly recorded in the original deed. Her hands were very steady when she pulled it off the post. She went inside and wrote 2 letters, one to a surveyor, one to a man in the city she'd heard was a lawyer who knew land law and didn't charge more than was fair. She sealed both envelopes and put them on the table to go out with tomorrow's mail. She didn't have money for a lawyer yet. She would have it soon. The cheese was moving well and the spring was still running, steady and cold and clear, up on the north slope where the goats had been circling all winter, where the ground had been warm under her palm in February while nobody else was paying attention. Harlan Briggs thought he was moving on her property. He was wrong about what he was moving on. Part 3. The Hidden Spring That Changes Everything. The lawyer's name was Arthur Pembroke, and he arrived on a Tuesday in early June, driving a rented buggy that had seen better years, wearing a coat with a frayed left cuff that he didn't seem to notice or didn't care about. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, compact and deliberate in his movements, with the kind of face that had learned not to show surprise because surprise was expensive in his line of work. He'd written back within a week of her letter, faster than she'd expected, saying he knew the Caldwell Crossing Valley, knew of the Briggs land holdings, and that the boundary dispute notice she'd described was worth looking at before it went any further. He walked the property line with her that first afternoon, reading the survey notice twice, then reading it a third time in a way that told her he'd found something in it, the second reading that he hadn't seen the first. "This is boilerplate," he said. "The language here, incorrectly recorded in the original deed, that's a standard opening move in a boundary challenge. They're not claiming anything specific yet. They're creating standing to make a claim." Meaning what exactly? Meaning someone filed this to establish a paper trail. Not because they have a genuine surveying dispute, because they want the legal mechanism in place to move faster later. He folded the notice and handed it back to her. Who filed it? The county land office, but the request came from a company called Western Valley Land Associates. He was quiet for a moment, in the precise way of a man running a name through his memory. "I've seen that name before. They operate out of the city. They acquire properties ahead of development, infrastructure projects, water rights transfers." He looked up at her. "What exactly do you have on this land, Mrs. Holloway?" She took him up to the north slope. He stood at the spring, fully cleared now, properly stoned around the edges by her and Cecil over 3 Saturdays in April, the water running clean and steady down the channeled path she'd cut to carry it to the lower trough, and he watched it for a long time without speaking. "How long has it been running like this?" he said. "Since March. We opened it in March. But it was here before, probably a very long time. Has anyone from the county assessed it?" "Not officially. I had Piotr Sevich look at it in February. He's a water diviner. I know that sounds." "I know Piotr," Pembroke said, which surprised her. "He's done good work in the eastern counties." "What did he say?" "Deep source. Moving water, not still, filtered through the mountain rock above." She paused. "He said it was very old." Pembroke looked at the spring again, then looked at the hills rising above it, then looked at the valley spread out below, the flat cattle country, the farming plots, the dry summer haze that was already settling in earlier than usual for June. "If this summer goes the way it looks," he said slowly, "and if the valley dries out the way the last 2 summers have been trending, this spring will be the only reliable water source in the area that doesn't depend on the river." He turned to look at her. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I'm beginning to," she said. "Western Valley Land Associates understands it already. That's why the notice is on your gate." He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the stone border. "We need to file a formal water rights claim with the county before they can muddy the legal ground any further, and we need to do it quickly." "How much will that cost?" He named a figure. It was more than she had liquid, less than she would have in 30 days based on the grocer's last order. 30 days, she said. "You have about that long before they can file a counter motion on the boundary claim," he said. "Maybe a little more." He put his hat on. "Don't sell anything and don't sign anything, whatever they offer you." She thought of the man she'd seen standing at her gate in May, looking up at the slope. What if they come in person? Pembroke looked at her with the flat, steady gaze of a man who has watched a lot of people make mistakes by being polite at the wrong moment. "Then you're very busy and you'll have your lawyer contact them." Oh. The drought arrived in July, the way bad things often do. Not announced, not dramatic at first, just a slow withdrawal of what everyone had been counting on. The rain that should have come in the last week of June didn't come. The river level, already lower than normal for the season, dropped another foot. The cattle ranchers on the flat valley floor started watching the sky with a particular kind of attention that people who depend on weather learn early and never stop doing. By mid-July, it was clear this was not a dry week or a dry spell. This was something structural, something that had been building through 2 mediocre rain years and was now arriving in full. Maris felt it on the hillside differently than the valley farmers felt it below. Her goats, by nature and by Gregor's careful management of the rotation, were already adapted to dry browse. They ranged more widely, took less water per day than cattle, and had been doing so for months. The spring on the north slope ran at the same steady pressure it had in March, unaffected by the surface conditions, because it wasn't surface water. It came from deep in the mountain, filtered through rock that had been accumulating it for longer than anyone in the valley had been alive. The hillside stayed green, not lush. It had never been lush, and Maris had stopped expecting lush, but green in the particular thin, persistent way of land that knows how to hold what it has. While the valley floor turned straw yellow and the creek beds showed more rock than water, the Holloway hillside maintained a color that people on the road below began to notice and comment on, with a mixture of confusion and something else, something less comfortable. Dale Pruckett noticed first. He rode up to the gate on a Wednesday in late July, alone, without his brother-in-law, which told her something about the nature of the visit. "Maris," he said. He'd stopped calling her Mrs. Holloway sometime in the spring, which she'd chosen not to address. "I heard you've got water running up here." "I have a spring?" "Yes." He looked up at the hillside. His cattle operation was one of the largest in the valley, 300 head, and she could see from the way he was holding his jaw that the drought was already hurting him. "How much flow?" "Enough for my herd and the cheese operation. Enough to spare, maybe." "Maybe." He turned the word over carefully. "I've got 40 head that are struggling. Hauling water from the river is costing me more than the cattle are worth at current prices. If I could get access to even a partial flow, Talk to my lawyer," she said. "Arthur Pembroke. He's in the city. I'll write you his address. Pruckett's jaw tightened slightly. Not anger, more like a man adjusting to a reality he'd expected to be simpler. I didn't know you had a lawyer. I got one in June. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite an apology and wasn't quite acknowledgement, but was somewhere uncomfortable between the two. He'd been one of the first ones laughing in the feed store. They both knew it without saying it. It's bad down there, he said, and his voice had dropped to something genuine, stripped of the social performance. Roy lost his creek entirely last week, dried up, first time in 30 years. She looked at him for a long moment. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had made easy choices when the cost was someone else's dignity, and now he was in a place where things were hard, and the person who could help him was the one he'd laughed at. Call on Pembroke, she said again. I'm not trying to make this difficult, Dale. I just need to do this right. He nodded. He rode back down the track without the particular ease he'd ridden up with. The hard part was what happened 4 days later. She came down the track into Caldwell Crossing for supplies and found 3 men she didn't know standing in front of the general store. Well-dressed, city-dressed, the kind of dress that announces that the wearer doesn't plan to do any physical work today or most days. One of them was the man in the good coat she'd seen with Harlan Briggs back in November, though he was wearing a different coat now. She recognized the way he held himself. She almost kept walking. She didn't. Mrs. Holloway. The tallest of the 3 stepped forward with the smooth, practiced movement of a man who spends most of his life introducing himself. I'm Franklin Cray, Western Valley Land Associates. We've been hoping to speak with you. You filed a boundary dispute notice on my property, she said. A routine survey request, he said, and his tone was so practiced in its reasonableness that she could tell he'd said the words many times. We're trying to ensure clear records across the valley, given some developments in the area. We're not adversaries, Mrs. Holloway. In fact, we'd very much like to be helpful. To who? To you, to the community. He gestured slightly with one hand, the gesture of a man indicating something that encompasses everything and costs him nothing. The drought is creating significant hardship across this region. We're prepared to invest in water infrastructure, proper infrastructure, engineered systems, storage capacity, that could benefit the entire valley, not just individual properties. Using my spring, she said. He didn't blink. Using all available resources, appropriately managed. And appropriately owned by whom? The smooth expression held. That's something we'd be happy to discuss. We're prepared to offer you— Talk to my lawyer, she said. Arthur Pembroke, city office. I'll write his name down if you need it. Something shifted in Franklin Cray's expression. Not much, not enough to call it anger, but a slight cooling behind the practiced warmth. Mrs. Holloway, I want to be direct with you. The boundary question is a legal matter that will proceed regardless of— Then it'll proceed through the legal process, she said. That's what the legal process is for. She picked up her supply list and walked into the general store. Inside, behind the counter, the owner's wife, a woman named Hester Falk, who had lived in Caldwell Crossing for 40 years and missed very little of what happened in it, watched her come in with an expression that was carefully not showing anything. 3 of them, Hester said after a pause. 3, Maris confirmed. Hester set a jar of molasses on the counter with a thump that expressed more than she said. Franklin Cray was in here yesterday, buying very little, talking to everyone. Asked Dale Pruckett if Pruckett thought the valley water situation might require outside investment. She paused. Dale told him he'd have to ask you. Maris looked up from her list. Dale said that? Loud enough for 4 people to hear, Hester said. So. She was halfway home when she saw the smoke. Not a large plume, not a structure fire, but the thin gray thread of a campfire or a brush burn up on the far northeast corner of her property line, in a section she rarely had reason to go. She'd been meaning to fence that corner properly for months and hadn't gotten to it yet. She turned the wagon around. It took her 20 minutes to reach the northeast corner, and when she got there she found 2 men she didn't recognize standing beside a surveying tripod, one of them writing in a ledger. They had a small camp set up, bedrolls, a cook fire, the organized, temporary look of men doing a several-day job. "This is Holloway property," she said from the wagon. The one with the ledger looked up without much surprise. "Survey work, ma'am. County request." "I received the boundary dispute notice. That doesn't authorize a survey team on my land without my permission." "We have a county work order. Show me." He did, and she read it carefully twice, and then read the authorization signature at the bottom. It was signed by a deputy county assessor she'd never heard of, not the assessor himself. She'd have to check whether a deputy had the authority to issue that particular order. She didn't know. She wrote down the deputy's name in the margin of her supply list. "Pack up and come back with paperwork signed by the county assessor himself," she said. "If the work order is legitimate, I won't interfere. But I'm not taking a deputy's signature on a survey authorization for my property." The man looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his colleague. They had the look of men who had been given instructions and were now encountering something their instructions hadn't accounted for. "We'll need to contact whoever you need to contact," she said. "But you're off my land while you do it." They broke down the tripod. She sat in the wagon and watched until they'd packed everything and walked back down to the road. And then she waited another 10 minutes after they were gone before she let herself breathe. Her hands were shaking again. She put them flat on her knees until they stopped. Then she drove home and wrote a very long letter to Arthur Pembroke. Pembroke arrived 2 days later, which told her the letter had alarmed him enough to move quickly. He read the deputy assessor's work order, read the name she'd written down, and sat at her kitchen table with his hands flat on the paper for a moment, in a way that reminded her, painfully, of the morning she'd pressed her palm to the warm ground on the north slope. "Aldous Ferris," he said, reading the deputy's name. "I know who he is." "Is the order legitimate?" "Technically, a deputy assessor can issue work orders for routine surveys. Whether this qualifies as routine is debatable." He looked up. "What concerns me more is the speed. They filed the boundary notice in May. They had a survey crew on your land by July. That's fast. Whoever's driving this has someone in the county office who is moving their paperwork to the front of the queue." "Briggs," she said. "Possibly. Western Valley Land Associates has relationships with multiple local officials across several counties. That's their operating model. They identify a target property, they create a legal cloud over the title, they make an offer while the owner is uncertain and frightened, and then they settle." He closed the folder. "They're very good at it." "What do we do?" "We file the water rights claim today. I have the paperwork with me. I drafted it on the ride out." He pulled a document from his case. "You sign this. I file it in the county seat tomorrow morning, and it goes on record before any boundary decision can affect it. Water rights in this territory are separate from land title in specific circumstances, and if we establish the claim first, a boundary adjustment, even a successful one, cannot automatically transfer the water rights." She read the document carefully. She was not a lawyer, but she'd been reading legal language for long enough now that she understood most of it. What Pembroke was doing was establishing that the spring was a distinct asset with its own recorded ownership, not merely an incidental feature of the land parcel. "Sign it," she said. "You're sure?" "I've been sure since March," she said. "Sign it and file it." She signed it. He filed it the next morning. The drought broke no records that August, not officially, but it was the worst the valley had seen in a generation in practical terms. And the numbers in the record books didn't capture what it felt like to watch your cattle standing in dust where there used to be water, or to haul tank wagons from a river that was dropping 2 inches a week. Roy Fenwick's creek was fully dry by the first week of August. His remaining cattle were in serious trouble. He came up to the Holloway gate without his brother-in-law, without his usual social armor, just a man in a bad situation who needed help. He stood at the gate and said, "I know I don't have any right to ask." "You don't," Maris said, and then, "But you're asking anyway." "I'm asking anyway." She'd been thinking about this since Dale Pruckett's visit. She'd talked to Pembroke about it. She'd talked to Gregor about it for 2 evenings running, sitting on the porch while the sun went down over the dry valley below. She'd had arguments with herself about it in the dark of 3 or 4 different nights, because she was not a saint and she remembered very specifically what Roy Fenwick had sounded like in the feed store and what his expression had been. And the human part of her that was not interested in being gracious wanted to let him stand at that gate for a while. She let him stand there for a moment, Not a long moment, but a real one. Arthur Pembroke is my lawyer, she said. He's drawing up water access agreements for valley ranchers at a standard rate per head per month. It's a fair rate. I set it below what hauling costs you. You sign the agreement, you get access to the trough on the lower north slope, and you follow the terms. She paused. The terms include a clause that acknowledges the water rights belong to this property. Non-negotiable. Roy looked at her for a long moment. He was a proud man, so she'd always known that it was most of his problem. And what she was asking him to sign was an acknowledgement that she had something he needed, that the widow on the worthless hillside held something valuable and he did not. Okay, he said. Just that. No elaboration. Pembroke's address. I'll get it from Dale, he said. He drove back down the track and she watched him go and felt none of the satisfaction she might have expected. Mostly, what she felt was tired, and something heavier than tired that she wasn't going to name. 7 ranchers had signed Pembroke's water access agreement by the 3rd week of August. 2 more were in discussion. The rate she'd set was fair. She'd meant it to be fair, not because she was feeling particularly generous, but because she'd thought it through and understood that a rate people could actually pay was the only rate that would actually work. Price them out, and they'd find other solutions and resent her for it. Price them right, and they paid, and the operation was sustainable. Gregor sat with her one evening going over the numbers, both of them at the kitchen table with the account books and the agreement copies spread out, and he said, "You have more money coming in from water agreements this month than from cheese." "I know," she said. "The cheese is still important," he said, a little defensive about it. "The cheese is still important," she agreed. "The cheese is how this started. The water is what it turned into." He looked at the papers for a moment. Edmund would not have known what to do with this. It was the first time either of them had said Edmund's name in a while. She let it sit in the room. "No," she said. "He wouldn't have." She didn't say it unkindly. It was just true. Edmund had been a good man with a particular kind of determination that didn't always bend when bending was what the situation required. He'd wanted the land to be what he wanted it to be. She had learned, slowly, badly, through a winter that had cost her 7 animals and 4 months of sleep and more doubt than she'd told anyone about, to ask the land what it was instead. Outside, the valley was dry and hot and still, the kind of August night that feels like it's never going to break. The goats were quiet on the slope. The spring ran on under the north ridge, cold and steady and old, indifferent to the drought, the way old things are indifferent to temporary conditions. It was Gregor who noticed the rider first, looking past her toward the window that faced down the track. "Someone coming," he said. She turned. It was late, past 8, the light almost gone, and a single rider was coming up the track at a pace that wasn't casual. She went to the door. The rider was Cecil Bright, and he was moving fast enough that she felt the cold threat of alarm before he'd stopped his horse. "Maris." He pulled up at the gate, out of breath, his horse lathered. "There's a meeting. In town. Tonight. It started an hour ago at the town hall. Cray's men called it." He caught his breath. "They're telling people the spring is contaminated." She stood very still. "What?" "They brought a man. Someone they introduced as a water analyst. And they're telling the ranchers who signed your agreements that the water hasn't been properly tested and that there may be contamination from the old mining activity in the hills above." He looked at her. His expression was a man who has just witnessed something that made him angry and scared in roughly equal measure. "They're saying the access agreements might be putting people's livestock at risk and should be suspended until an independent assessment." "That's not true," she said. "Piotr assessed it in February. The water comes through solid mountain rock. There's no mining on the slope above." "I know that," Cecil said, "but the people in that room don't know that. And Cray's man has paper credentials and a confident manner, and people are frightened because their cattle are dying, and they want someone to tell them what to do." Gregor had come to stand behind her. She didn't need to look at him to know his expression. She picked up her coat off the hook by the door. "How long to get there?" she said. 20 minutes if you push." "Saddle my horse," she said. "I'll get the water sample records." "What records?" She was already at the cabinet by the window, pulling out the notebook she'd kept since February. her own documentation of the spring, Pyotr's notes transcribed in her hand, the flow measurements, the clarity observations, the complete absence of any geological mining activity within a mile of the source. It wasn't a lab report, but it was 12 pages of careful, dated, specific documentation by a woman who had been paying attention when no one else was. She pulled on her coat. "Grigor," she said, "stay here. If anyone comes to the property tonight, don't let them near the spring." He looked at her with those pale gray eyes, steady as always, and nodded once. She rode down the dark track toward Caldwell Crossing at a pace that was probably not sensible and didn't care, the notebook tucked under her arm, the lantern swinging on the saddle hook, the dry valley air rushing past her face. Behind her, on the north slope, the spring ran on in the dark, clean and cold, and entirely unaware that a man in a city coat was telling a room full of frightened people it was killing their animals. Some things, Maris was learning, could not wait until morning. And some fights? The kind where someone was willing to lie in a room full of your neighbors to take what was yours. Those you had to walk into while your hands were still shaking and your voice was still steady, and the only thing you had to show was 12 pages of handwritten notes and the particular authority of a woman who had been standing in that water every day since March. She rode harder. Part 4. A bold choice that unites the valley. The Caldwell Crossing Town Hall was a single-room building that smelled of pine resin and old tobacco, with benches arranged in rows and a raised platform at the front where the town selectmen sat on the occasions that required selectmen. Tonight it was packed. She could see the light spilling through the windows from 50 yards out and hear the low rumble of voices that told her the room was full and the mood was unsettled. She tied her horse at the post outside and took a breath before she went in. Inside, Franklin Cray was standing on the platform with a man she hadn't seen before. Heavy-set, wearing spectacles, holding a sheaf of papers with the self-important posture of a man who has been paid to look authoritative. The benches were full of faces she recognized. Dale Pruckett and his brother-in-law in the second row, Roy Fenwick toward the back, Hester Falk from the general store standing against the side wall with her arms crossed. Cecil Bright slipped in behind Maris as she came through the door. The man with the spectacles was mid-sentence. Cannot rule out subsurface mineral intrusion from legacy mining activity in the Upper Ridge geology. Our assessment indicates that without formal laboratory certification, any water source in that area should be considered potentially compromised until— That's not accurate, Maris said. The room turned. 40-some faces, all at once. Franklin Cray's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A small recalibration. The kind a man makes when a variable he'd accounted for shows up earlier than expected. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, with the warmth of a man who practices warmth. "We're glad you're here. We were discussing some concerns about the water source on your property, concerns that affect the entire community's health, and we felt it was important to— There is no legacy mining on the upper ridge above my spring." She walked forward through the room. People moved slightly, not dramatically, but enough to let her through. The nearest mining claim was filed in 1849 and abandoned by 1851. It was on the western face, not the northern face. The geology between that claim and my spring includes a solid granite shelf that has been confirmed by 2 separate assessments. She stopped at the front of the room and opened her notebook on the edge of the platform. This is 12 pages of documented observation on the spring source going back to February. Flow rate, clarity, temperature variance, browse consumption by animals drinking from it, and the health records of those same animals. All dated, all signed. The man with the spectacles looked at Cray. Cray looked at the notebook. "Mrs. Holloway, personal observations aren't the same as laboratory analysis." "No, they're not," she agreed. "Which is why I also have this." She pulled a folded letter from inside the notebook. She had almost not brought it. It had been sitting in her cabinet for 3 weeks, from a university agricultural extension office in the city that she'd written to in June, asking about the geological characteristics of mountain-fed springs in the hill country region. She hadn't known at the time that she'd need it in a public meeting. She'd written because she wanted to understand what she had. This is from the College of Agricultural Sciences. The faculty geologist reviewed the topographical description of my spring source, the rock formation type, the water characteristics I described, and gave a written assessment. Would you like me to read it? Cray said nothing. She read the relevant section. It was 3 sentences, precise and technical, stating that a spring of the described characteristics sourced from the upper granite shelf formation was chemically isolated from surface mineral activity by the nature of the rock itself. It was not absolute proof. It was not a laboratory test. But it was written on university letterhead by a man with credentials, and it said the opposite of what Cray's man had just said. The room was quiet. Dale Pruckett spoke first, which surprised her. How much would an actual laboratory test cost? I've been getting estimates, she said. About $12 for a full panel. I'll put in 3, Pruckett said. Hester Falk said, from the wall, I'll put in 2. Roy Fenwick, in the back, said nothing for a long moment. Then, I'll put in 2. It wasn't unanimous. Some people in the room stayed quiet, and some of them she suspected were in Cray's corner by interest or inclination. But the momentum had shifted in the way that room momentum shifts, fast and visibly, and Franklin Cray could feel it as well as she could. He tried once more. The boundary survey is still an active legal matter. That's for the county to process, Maris said. If Western Valley Land Associates has a legitimate boundary claim, they're welcome to pursue it through the proper channels. Arthur Pembroke is my legal representative. His contact information is available. She closed her notebook. Is there anything else the community needs to discuss tonight? There wasn't, not from Cray's direction. The meeting dissolved the way meetings do when the reason for them has been removed, gradually, in clusters, people talking to each other rather than to the platform. Cray said something to his man with the spectacles in a low voice, and they moved toward the door, not quickly enough to look like retreat, but quickly enough that it was. Cecil Bright caught her arm near the back of the room. That letter, he said quietly. When did you get that? 3 weeks ago. You just happened to have it. I happened to have asked for it in June because I wanted to understand what I owned, she said. That's not the same as happening. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Then he nodded, just once, and let go of her arm. She rode home in the dark and found Gregor sitting on the porch with a lantern and a cold cup of coffee, which told her he'd been waiting and hadn't wanted to wait inside. Well, he said. We're getting a laboratory test done, she said, tying her horse. The community is splitting the cost. And Cray? He left. She sat down on the porch steps. The night was dry and warm, and the stars were very clear in the way they get only when there's no moisture in the air at all. He'll be back. Not tonight, but he'll be back. What does Pembroke say about the boundary claim? He says it's weak, deliberately weak, designed to create uncertainty, not to win in court. If it gets to a judge, it likely fails. But getting it to a judge takes time and money, and they're counting on me not having enough of either. Gregor was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark hillside. The goats were shapes in the dark, settled for the night. Do you have enough? He said. She was quiet for a moment too, doing the honest arithmetic. Maybe. The water agreements are generating real income now. The cheese order is solid, but legal costs are unpredictable, and Pembroke's time isn't free. She paused. I have enough to fight for a while. I don't know if I have enough to fight to the end. He made a sound that wasn't agreement or disagreement, just acknowledgement of the reality of it. My wife, he said after a while, when we came to this country, we had $40 between us. Everything we tried to build, someone had a reason it wouldn't work. Too foreign, too old-fashioned, wrong place, wrong method. He paused. What she used to say was, you don't need enough to win all at once. You need enough to still be standing when they get tired. Maris looked at him sideways. Did that work for her? Sometimes, he said. She was very stubborn. Sounds familiar. He almost smiled. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow is a long day. The laboratory test results came back in September, 2 weeks after she'd sent the samples. The water was clean, not just acceptable. The report used the word exceptional, which the lab analyst had apparently included voluntarily because he found the mineral profile interesting from a scientific standpoint. The spring was producing water of a quality that was, the report said, consistent with deep granite-filtered mountain sources, free of any surface or subsurface mineral contamination, and with a mineral composition that was, Incidentally, potentially beneficial for livestock health. She read that word, exceptional, 3 times. She sent a copy to Pembroke. She sent a copy to Theodore Alcott at the bank, for reasons she found difficult to fully articulate, but that felt right. She kept the original in the cabinet where she kept the things that mattered. She did not send a copy to Franklin Cray. She didn't need to. Hester Falk had the results posted in the general store window by noon on the day they arrived, which was more effective than anything Maris could have arranged. What happened next was not dramatic in the way she might have imagined it being dramatic. There was no single confrontation, no moment of public defeat for Cray and his company. What there was instead was a slow, practical withdrawal. The way water drains from a field after a flood, not all at once, just consistently and in one direction. The boundary survey team did not return to her property. The county deputy assessor who had signed the work order was quietly reassigned to a different district, which Pembroke mentioned in a letter without elaborating on how he knew or what it meant. The formal boundary challenge remained technically open in the county records, but no further filings were made on it, and Pembroke told her that a challenge without forward movement would lapse within 18 months under territorial procedure. She asked him once, directly, what he thought Western Valley Land Associates would do next. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man being careful. Men like Cray don't make expensive mistakes twice in the same place, he said. They'll have assessed what happened here, the community response, the water rights claim on record, the laboratory results, and they'll have decided the cost of pursuing this specific property no longer justifies the potential return. They'll move to a different target. Someone with less to fight with, she said. Yes, he said. That's how it works. She sat with that for a long time after she'd put down his letter. The relief was real and she didn't pretend it wasn't. But the other thing, the knowledge that what had been aimed at her had simply relocated to someone else who might not have a Pembroke or a Gregor or 12 pages of handwritten notes, that didn't go away cleanly. She filed it in the cabinet with the things that mattered and didn't have answers yet. October arrived and the drought broke. Not with the dramatic violence of a storm, just steady rain for 4 days, the kind that soaks deep instead of running off, the kind the valley had been desperate for since June. The river came back up. The creek beds showed water again. Roy Fenwick's dry creek ran a thin thread by the 3rd day, which he mentioned to Maris when he came to pay the September water access fee with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. The creek's coming back, he said, setting the payment on the table. I heard, she said. Good. He looked at her with the particular discomfort of a man who has been in the wrong for long enough that he's lost track of how to move out of it without making it worse. He picked up his hat. He put it back down. I owe you an apology, he said. The words came out like something he'd been carrying for a while and wasn't sure how to set down. Back in October last year at the feed store, I said some things He stopped, restarted. I was unkind, is what I'm saying. About the goats and about your prospects. I was unkind about it, and I was wrong about it, and I'm sorry. She looked at him. Roy Fenwick was not a man built for this kind of conversation. She could see the effort it had cost him to get there, the rigidity in his shoulders that came from someone who has swallowed their pride so many times they're not sure they have any left. Okay, she said. He waited, maybe for more, maybe for her to make it easier or harder. I mean it, he said. I know you do, she said. Okay, Roy. He picked up his hat and left. She stood at the door and watched the wagon go down the track and felt, unexpectedly, not the satisfaction of being owed something that had been paid, but something quieter and less tidy than that. Something like the end of a long tension, not a triumph, but a release. The kind of thing that doesn't feel like winning, because winning had stopped being the point sometime in the last 12 months without her noticing exactly when. The harder conversation came 3 days later, and it was not one she'd prepared for. Harlan Briggs rode up to the gate on a Thursday morning, alone, no associate in a good coat, no performance of business. Just Harlan Briggs, who had been the first one to tell her she'd lose the land and had spent a year trying to help that prediction come true. She was working the upper pasture when she saw him, rotating the herd through the section that had recovered best from the summer's dry stretch. She didn't hurry down. She finished what she was doing, told herself she was finishing because the rotation mattered, and not because she wanted him to wait, and then walked down. He was still mounted when she reached the gate. That told her something. Men who dismount are making themselves less certain, and Harlan Briggs was not a man comfortable with uncertainty. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. "Mr. Briggs." A silence. He looked at the slope behind her, at the goats, at the lower trough that still had water running to it from the spring, even now that the rains had come back. "I knew about the water," he said. She hadn't expected him to say it outright. She'd expected denial, or deflection, or some version of the practiced reasonableness that Cray had used. Not this. "I know you did," she said. "I had a geologist look at the survey maps 2 years ago, before Edmund got sick. He thought there was a strong probability of a subsurface spring somewhere on the north face of the ridge." He paused. "Edmund didn't know. Nobody knew. I was waiting to see if it was real before I moved on it." "And then Edmund died," she said, "and you thought you could move faster." "Yes," he said, flatly and without decoration. He was not apologizing. She understood that about him. A man like Harlan Briggs could be honest without being sorry, and she'd rather have the honesty. "What do you want?" she said. "I want to know if there's a way to do business with you," he said. "Not acquire the property, not the spring, access rights, paid access, same terms as the other ranchers, managed through your lawyer." He looked at her directly for the first time. "My operation is the largest in the valley. Having access to your water agreements on legitimate terms is worth more to me than continuing a fight I've already lost." She studied him. The man who had sat on his horse and told her she'd sell at a discount or starve. The man who had sent someone to stand at her gate in May, who had put his people in contact with Western Valley Land Associates, who had, she was fairly certain, though she couldn't prove it, been the one who'd facilitated the boundary claim. She was not going to pretend that none of that had happened, but she was also not going to pretend that refusing him made practical sense. "Same terms as everyone else," she said. "Pembroke's standard agreement. The clause acknowledging water rights is non-negotiable." His jaw tightened. That clause specifically, the written acknowledgement, was the part that would cost him the most, not in money, but in the particular currency that mattered to Harlan Briggs. It was a document admitting he needed something she owned. "I understand the clause," he said, "and the boundary challenge gets withdrawn," she said. "In writing. Filed with the county before you get access." A longer pause this time. "That can be arranged," he said. "Then contact Pembroke," she said. "He handles the agreements." He nodded once. He turned his horse. He rode back down the track without another word. She watched him go for a moment, then looked up at the hillside where the goats were moving along the slope in the morning light, following whatever it was they always followed, unhurried, systematic, doing what goats do on rough ground that everyone once agreed was worthless. She felt tired. She felt something that might eventually become satisfaction but hadn't finished forming yet. She felt, underneath both of those, a bone-deep awareness that the ground she was standing on was hers, legally and genuinely, and on the record, in a way that it hadn't been when she'd buried Edmund 12 months ago. She went back up the slope to finish the rotation. Pembroke came out the following week to review the withdrawal of the boundary challenge and finalize the Briggs access agreement. He sat at the kitchen table with the documents laid out and went through them with the methodical care she'd come to expect from him, flagging 2 places where the language was less precise than he wanted and making her wait while he redrafted them by hand. "You could have taken a settlement from Briggs in March," he said at one point, not looking up from the paper. "He would have offered enough to clear the debt, and then some." "I know. It would have been the simpler choice." "I know that too." He looked up then. "I'm not saying you were wrong. I'm saying you could have been wrong the other way too, and it worked out." He paused. "I've seen a lot of people fight for what they owned and lose it anyway. The outcome isn't always proof that the decision was right." She thought about that. It was the kind of thing a lawyer said when he wanted to be honest with you, and the honest thing wasn't easy. "If I'd sold," she said slowly, "the spring would belong to someone who would have charged whatever the market could bear in a drought year. The ranchers who needed it most would have been the ones who could afford it least." She paused. I'm not saying I'm a hero. I'm saying that was a consequence I could see, and I chose not to create it. Pembroke looked at her for a moment. That's a more principled answer than most of my clients would give. Most of your clients probably aren't 25-year-old women who just learned how to make cheese? He almost laughed. Not quite, but close. He went back to the documents. When everything was signed and properly countersigned, he gathered the papers back into his case and stood. At the door, he paused. The water rights claim is solid, he said. As solid as I can make it. But land law changes, administrations change, and Briggs isn't the last person who'll look at what you have here and want to find a way to it. He looked at her steadily. Stay informed. Keep good records. Don't let the agreements lapse. I won't, she said. And raise your cheese prices, he said. You're undercharging by at least 20%. She blinked. That's your legal advice? That's my practical advice. The legal advice is in the documents. He picked up his case. Good evening, Mrs. Holloway. He drove back down the track, and she stood in the doorway for a moment with the signed copies in her hand and thought about raising the cheese prices, which was the most ordinary thought she'd had in months and felt, for that reason, almost luxurious. Gregor came the following morning, and she told him about Briggs, about the withdrawal, about the agreement. He listened without interrupting, which was his way when something mattered. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. And the spring agreements, he said. You'll keep them running, even with the rains back? Yes, the rains this year doesn't mean drought next year. And people paid in the hard months. I'm not going to pull the rug when it's easier. She paused. I want to formalize it more. A proper water cooperative structure, something that gives the participating ranchers a voice in how it's managed. Pembroke thinks it's possible. Gregor looked at her. You'd give them a voice. A voice, not ownership, but a stake in making it work. She'd been thinking about this for 2 weeks. The distinction mattered, and she wasn't sure she'd explained it right yet. What I don't want is for this to be a thing I own that people need. I want it to be a thing the valley runs together that I initiated and maintain rights to. She stopped. That probably sounds naive. It sounds like something my wife would have said, Gregor said, which was the highest thing he offered, and they both understood that. He stayed for the afternoon. They worked the herd together, moving them through the post-rain browse that was coming back green and dense on the south slope. He corrected her twice, once on the timing of a gate move, once on her reading of one of the older does who was showing early signs of a joint issue, and she took both corrections without arguing, because he was right both times. In the late afternoon, sitting on the rock outcrop above the spring with their boots in the wet grass and the valley spread below. Catching the last light, he said something she hadn't expected. I want to write down everything I know, he said, all of it, not just the cheese notes, the rotation management, the health signs, the breeding cycles, the reading of the browse, everything. He was looking at the valley, not at her. I'm old. My children don't want this life. I don't want what I know to just go. He paused. If you're willing, I'd like to write it here, with you. So there's a place it lives after I'm gone. She looked at him. He was not a man who talked about dying, not because he was afraid of it, but because he found self-pity wasteful. This was not self-pity. This was something else. A practical man making a practical arrangement. I'm willing, she said. He nodded once, satisfied, and that was the end of that conversation. Below them, the valley was settling into the particular gold of a late October evening after the first good rains, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's been holding its breath and has just let it go. The ranchers who had signed her agreements were down there, their cattle getting the water they needed from creeks and rivers that were recovering. The crisis that had seemed like it might break the valley having resolved into something that hadn't been easy, but had held. The spring ran behind her, quiet and steady, the way it had been running since March, the way it had been running for far longer than that before she'd found it. She thought about Edmund, which she didn't let herself do very often because it still pulled in a direction she couldn't entirely afford. She thought about what he would have done differently, what he would have done the same. She thought about the $40 in the tin box that was empty now, and the goats that had been starving and weren't anymore, and the hillside that everyone agreed was worthless and had turned out to be something else entirely. She thought about the mortgage payment she would make in November, which would be the fourth consecutive payment since May and would bring the account current by every possible measure. She thought about the letter she needed to write to the University Agricultural Extension Office, thanking the geologist whose 3 sentences had helped turn a town meeting around. She thought about raising the cheese prices 20%, which was probably the right call and which she should have done 2 months ago. The light faded. Gregor stood up slowly, one knee at a time. She stood with him. "Tomorrow," he said, meaning the work. "Tomorrow," she agreed. They walked back down the hillside together in the early dark. The goats settling around them, the spring running behind them, the valley below going quiet. The way valleys go quiet in the evening after a long, grinding, difficult year that has finally, not cleanly, not perfectly, but genuinely, started to turn. Part 5. The Woman Who Rewrote the Frontier. The cheese won a ribbon at the Territorial Agricultural Fair in November. Not first place. She was honest with herself about that. And Gregor was more honest still, pointing out that the aging time on the winning entry from a dairy operation in the Eastern District had been longer by 3 weeks, and the flavor profile more developed as a result. But second place, in a field of 11 entries for a woman who had been making cheese for less than a year, on a hillside that everyone in her county had written off as productive for nothing. That was not nothing. She brought the ribbon home and put it on the cabinet shelf above the tin box that had once held $40 and now held the signed copy of the Water Cooperative Charter, the laboratory water report, and the letter from the grocer in the city that had started everything that came after. She looked at the ribbon for a moment, then went out to check the evening rotation, because the goats didn't care about ribbons, and the North Slope section needed moving before dark. That was the rhythm of things now. Recognition arrived and she received it and then went back to the work. Because the work was what made the recognition possible, and the work didn't stop. She had understood this in theory since February. By November, she understood it in her bones, in the particular way that things become true when you've lived them instead of just thought them. The herd was 63 animals now. She'd lost 7 in the winter, bought 8 healthy young does in the spring from a rancher 2 valleys over who bred good stock, and the natural increase through the year had brought the number to 63. They were unrecognizable from the 55 starving animals she'd walked up the track 14 months ago. Fat in the way goats get fat, not soft, but solid. The weight of animals that are doing what they're built to do on terrain that suits them. Their coats had come in thick for winter. Their milk was steady and rich. Gregor said once, in October, that he'd never seen a herd turned around that fast. She didn't say anything to that. She just wrote it down in the notebook she kept now. Not the crisis notebook, not the record-keeping notebook, but a different one, newer, that she'd started in August. She wasn't sure yet what it was for. She just wrote things down when they seemed worth keeping. The Water Cooperative had its first formal meeting in the second week of November, in the same town hall where Cray had stood 3 months earlier and tried to tell people her water would kill their animals. Pembroke had drafted the cooperative charter over the course of 6 weeks, going back and forth with her on specifics that she hadn't known enough to question at first and had learned enough to refine as they went. The structure gave 12 participating ranchers and farm operations a formal voice in the management protocols of the water access system. Rotation of access slots during high-demand periods, maintenance responsibilities, dispute resolution, while maintaining clear legal ownership of the water rights with the Holloway property. She had explained it to people one at a time before the meeting because she'd learned that people needed to understand something privately before they could agree to it publicly. Dale Pruckett. She talked to on his fence line on a Monday afternoon. Roy Fenwick over his kitchen table the following Thursday, which was where Roy processed things that mattered to him, apparently. Hester Falk at the general store, who was not a rancher and not a water user, but who was, functionally, the person whose opinion shaped Caldwell Crossing's collective sense of things more than anyone with an official title. "It's a fair structure," Hester said, reading the summary document Maris had brought. "You're not asking for gratitude." I'm not asking for gratitude, Maris agreed. I'm asking for cooperation. Some people will confuse those two things. Some people always do, Maris said. Hester handed the document back. I'll be at the meeting, she said, which was her way of saying she was in favor. The meeting itself was not smooth. 11 people in a room with a legal charter rarely produces smooth. There were questions about the maintenance cost allocation that required Pembroke to walk through the math twice, a disagreement between Roy Fenwick and a farmer named Osterman about access slot timing that got louder than necessary before Maris called it back to the written protocol, and a long silence after the vote that she didn't know how to read until Dale Pruckett broke it by saying, I'll second the motion, and the charter passed 9-2 with one abstention. The two who voted against it were people she hadn't expected to bring along anyway. The abstention was Cecil Bright, which surprised her until she spoke to him afterward. Why did you abstain? She said. He looked slightly uncomfortable. I didn't think my vote should be the deciding one. It wasn't my place. She looked at him for a moment, trying to understand what he meant. You had as much right to vote as anyone in that room. I know, he said, but I was the only one who didn't use the water in the drought. I showed up with a shovel in February, and I've been helping you since then, and I don't know, it felt wrong to vote on something I benefited from building. He paused. That probably doesn't make sense. It makes a certain kind of sense, she said. It's also not necessary. You could have voted yes. Maybe next time, he said. She let it go. Cecil Bright had his own way of working through things, and it was, she'd come to understand, a careful way. Slower than average, but more considered, which was a better combination than the reverse. December brought the second mortgage payment of the current arrears period, and with it, the end of the formal catch-up schedule. She was current on the loan. Not paid off, the principal was still substantial and would take years at the current payment rate, but current with a payment history since May that Theodore Alcott had apparently shown to his board as a notable case of property recovery. He told her this himself, in the stiff, slightly reluctant way that bankers tell you when you've surprised them. The board is prepared to discuss a refinancing arrangement at the start of next year, he said. Lower rate, extended term, better structure for a going concern. That would be welcome, she said. You'd need a proper business valuation, he said. The spring adds significant asset value, but we'd need documentation. I'll have Pembroke put together the package, she said. He looked at her across his desk with an expression that had changed in increments too small to catch over the 14 months since she'd sat across from him asking for 60 days. He wasn't warm. Theodore Alcott didn't do warm, but there was a quality to his attention now that was different from what it had been when she was a widow behind on her payments. He was paying attention to her the way he paid attention to things that mattered. Good, he said. Beginning of January. She drove home from that meeting in the December cold with the thin winter sun making long shadows across the road, and she thought about money in the way she'd been thinking about it for 14 months, carefully, practically, without sentiment. And then she thought about something else for a while. She thought about the woman she'd been the night she'd spread those papers on the kitchen table after Edmund's funeral. The arithmetic that wouldn't say anything different, the $40 in the tin box, the feeling of standing at the edge of something she couldn't see the bottom of. She hadn't known, that night, what she was going to do. She'd thought she had a plan. The goats, the hillside, the instinct that had felt more like desperation than strategy. But a plan requires knowing the terrain, and she hadn't known anything about the terrain she was walking into. She'd had $40 and a refusal to sell and an old man on the other side of the ridge she hadn't met yet. That was all. She pulled the wagon into the yard and sat in it for a minute after she'd stopped the horse, looking at the hillside in the winter light. The goats were up on the south slope, clustered in that particular way they had when the temperature dropped, close enough to share warmth, spread enough to keep browsing. 63 of them. She hadn't lost one since August. She got out of the wagon and went inside and started a letter to Pembroke about the refinancing valuation, and then stopped in the middle of the second sentence because she wanted to write something else first. She got out the newer notebook, the one she didn't have a name for yet, and wrote at the top of a fresh page, "What I would tell someone starting with nothing." She sat there with the pen for a long time. Then she wrote, "The land you think is worthless is the land nobody has asked the right question of yet." She looked at it. It wasn't a lesson exactly. It was more like an observation that had taken 14 months and several near disasters to produce. She left it there and went back to Pembroke's letter. Mumtet. Gregor started bringing his notebooks in January. Not all at once. He would arrive in the morning with one or two, set them on the kitchen table, and they would work through them together, him explaining the shorthand and the Hungarian phrases and the contextual knowledge that didn't exist on the page, her writing the expanded version in cleaner English in a separate ledger she'd bought for the purpose. It was slow work. Some mornings they'd cover 2 pages of his notes in 3 hours because a single line about browse management opened into 45 minutes of him describing a specific hillside in Hungary and what the goats had done there and why, and her asking questions that sent him into other memories and other knowledge he'd almost forgotten he had. She was aware, without either of them naming it, that this was not just a practical project. He was 74 years old in January, and the winter was hard on his joints in ways he mentioned only when he had to, and the notebooks represented everything he'd learned in a life that had crossed an ocean and outlasted his wife and his children's interest in what he knew. Getting it out of his head and onto paper that would last was urgent in a way that neither of them made melodramatic. On a Thursday in late January, he arrived with a notebook she hadn't seen before, older than the others, the cover almost worn through, the pages soft with handling. "This one is different," he said, setting it on the table. She looked at it. "What's in it?" "My wife's notes, her cheese methods, her specific variations, the things she did that I never quite replicated exactly." He sat down. "Her handwriting is better than mine. Her explanations are better than mine." He paused. "She was better at the cheese than I was. I was better at the animals. We made a good pair for that reason." She opened the notebook carefully. The handwriting inside was indeed better than Gregor's, so precise and small, with occasional drawings of what appeared to be curd configurations and pressing arrangements. "What was her name?" Maris asked. She realized she'd never asked. "Borbala," he said. "Bori, I called her. She hated that." He almost smiled. "I kept calling her that anyway." She looked at the notebook for a moment. "We'll do this one last," she said, "after we've finished yours. So I understand your methods first, and then I can understand how hers built on them." He looked at her with those washed-out gray eyes. "That's how she would have done it," he said. They worked until late afternoon, and when he left, she stood in the doorway and watched him walk across the yard with the particular careful gait of a man who has learned to be deliberate about where he puts his feet on cold ground. And she felt something tighten in her chest that she recognized as the specific worry of someone who has come to depend on another person's presence in the world. She didn't say anything to him about it. Some things you carry without putting them down. Spring came again, and with it the second year of the cheese operation running at full capacity and the first full year of the water cooperative functioning as a formal structure. The grocer in the city had referred her to 2 other accounts over the winter, a hotel dining room and a specialty provisions merchant who supplied to establishments 40 miles further east. By March, she had 3 buyers and was producing at a rate that required her to take on help for the first time. A woman named Della, who was 28 and had grown up on a dairy farm and knew milk, and whose need for work had arrived at the same time as Maris's need for another set of hands. Della was not easy. She had opinions about the cheese-making process that she stated directly and without much softening, and 2 of those opinions turned out to be correct, which required Maris to revise methods she'd been comfortable with. That was uncomfortable in the particular way that being right about something and then finding out you were partially wrong always is. "The pressing weight on the medium rounds," Della said one morning, not for the first time. "You're inconsistent, some days heavier, some days lighter, and you can taste it in the finished product. It needs to be standardized." "Gregor uses a consistent weight," Maris said. "Gregor isn't here every morning, and you are," Della said. "And your hands are stronger than you think. You press harder when you're tired, lighter when you're not. You need a mechanical press." Maris looked at her for a moment. She had been making cheese for almost a year and a half, and she still didn't entirely know what she didn't know, which was humbling in a way she hadn't expected to still be dealing with this far in. "How much does a proper mechanical press cost?" she said. "Less than you think," Della said, which turned out to be true. They ordered one in April, and Gregor spent a morning examining it with the deep suspicion of a man who has done something by hand for 50 years and is not convinced machinery improves on it. Then he tested the result and was quiet for a while. "It's consistent," he said finally. "That's what Della said," Maris said. He looked at Della. Della looked back at him with the equanimity of someone who was used to being the youngest person whose opinion turned out to be right. "Humph," Gregor said, which was his concession. Hunts. The boundary challenge lapsed formally in late March, 18 months after it had been filed, exactly as Pembroke had said it would. The county sent a notice confirming the lapse. She put it in the cabinet. The bank refinancing came through in February at a rate 2 points lower than the original mortgage, with a term that made the monthly payment manageable against the current income. She signed the papers in Alcott's office, and he shook her hand across the desk with more warmth than she'd expected from him, which told her that the handshake meant something to him too, in whatever quiet way bankers let things mean something. Arthur Pembroke sent her a bill in January that was less than his usual rate, with a note that said only, "Pleasure doing business." She paid the full standard rate anyway and told him why in a short letter. He wrote back that this was unnecessary. She wrote back that she was aware of that. That exchange, she felt, told her everything she needed to know about Arthur Pembroke. Cecil Bright had expanded his sheep operation by 15 animals in the fall, using a rotation method he'd learned watching her manage the goat herd over the winter. He didn't ask her permission to adapt the method, and she hadn't expected him to. It was observation, not theft, and she'd told him as much the one time he mentioned it, with the slight awkwardness of a man uncertain whether he owed someone something. "Watch all you want," she said. "That's how Gregor taught me." "He taught you by letting you watch?" "He taught me by doing and letting me watch, and then correcting me when I tried it wrong. Same principle." She looked at him. "How are the sheep doing on the east slope?" "Good," he said, with a surprise in his voice that told her he still half expected things not to work. "Really good, actually." "Then you're doing it right," she said. "Mostly." He almost laughed. The mostly was intentional, and they both knew it, but there was no sting in it, which was how she knew they'd moved past the early awkwardness into something more straightforward. The second ribbon from the territorial fair came in November of that second year. First place this time, in the aged hard variety, with a written note from the judging panel that Gregor read 3 times, and then folded and put in his coat pocket without comment. She let him keep it. He had earned it as much as she had, and they both understood that the note was really about Borbala's methods applied through Gregor's hands, transmitted through Maris's learning, and finally pressed consistently with Della's mechanical press, and that was not a simple lineage to reduce to a single name. She put the ribbon on the shelf with the first one. 2 ribbons and a tin box and a water cooperative charter and a mortgage that was being paid, and 63 goats, healthy and growing, on a hillside that the entire Caldwell Crossing Valley had once agreed was good for nothing. That was the accounting, if you wanted to do it that way. She didn't, particularly. Numbers had been useful to her, necessary, often urgent, but they had never been the point. The point was something harder to put down on paper, something she kept trying to write in the unnamed notebook and kept finding the edges of but not the center of. She tried again on an evening in November, sitting at the kitchen table with the fire going and the sound of rain on the roof for the first time since the drought year, real rain, the deep, persistent kind. What I would tell someone starting with nothing, she'd written at the top back in December. She'd added things over the course of the year. The land asking the right question. The difference between patience and waiting. Patience was active, waiting was passive. They felt the same from outside, but were nothing alike from inside. The way knowledge transferred between people was almost never efficient and was almost always worth it anyway. The specific loneliness of being the person in the room who knows something that everyone else is going to find out the hard way. Tonight, she added, "The people who laughed at you will need things from you eventually. How you handle that is who you are." She looked at it. It wasn't generous advice exactly. It didn't say to be gracious about it, didn't say to forgive them, didn't say that their need somehow erased their unkindness. What it said was, you will have a choice, and the choice will define you more than what they did defined them. She had tried, mostly, to make the right choice. She hadn't always felt generous doing it. Roy Fenwick's apology had moved her more than she'd expected, and the feeling had been complicated in ways she hadn't fully sorted out. Harlan Briggs paying his monthly water access fee through Pembroke's office, the same Harlan Briggs who had told her she'd starve off the land, that she had not forgiven in any clean sense of the word, but she'd made the business decision, and the business decision was right. And she'd decided that those two things could coexist without needing to be resolved into something tidier. Life, she was learning, did not resolve into something tidier. It just kept going, with the loose ends left loose and the complicated feelings staying complicated, and you kept walking through it as honestly as you could manage. It was Gregor who brought it to a point, on a Tuesday in late November, in a way she hadn't expected. They were up on the north slope, above the spring, where they sometimes sat in the late afternoon when the work was done and the light was good. He was moving more slowly these days. His left knee was a genuine problem now, one he'd finally admitted to in October. But he still came up the slope, still wanted to be up here where the view was longest and the air carried what it carried. He'd brought both their coffees in a tin pail the way he sometimes did. She didn't know when this had become a habit. Sometime in the spring, she thought. It had just started happening and then continued. They sat for a while without talking, which was comfortable between them in the way that silence is comfortable between people who have spent enough time together to fill it when they want to and not fill it when they don't. "I want to ask you something," Gregor said. She looked at him. He was looking at the valley, at the light on the flat cattle country below, the way the November afternoon made everything gold and a little melancholy. "When you spent the $40, he said, "on the goats, what were you actually thinking? Not the reasoning. You've explained the reasoning. What were you feeling?" She was quiet for a moment. It was not a question she'd been asked directly before. "Terrified," she said. "I thought I was probably wrong. I thought there was a good chance I was going to lose everything." She paused. "But I thought, if I'm going to lose it anyway, I'd rather lose it doing something that had a chance. And if it hadn't worked, then I'd have lost it," she said, "and I'd have found something else. I don't know what." She looked at him. "Why are you asking?" He was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the scrub on the slope below them. The goats, visible further down, moved in their slow, unhurried way. "Because I think people in the valley," he said slowly, "they look at what you built and they tell each other a certain kind of story about it. That you were brave, that you were smart, that you saw something they didn't see." He paused. "What they don't understand is that you didn't know it was going to work. You were just as uncertain as any of them. You were just less willing to let the uncertainty stop you." She looked at him. "Is that different?" "It's the only thing that's different," he said. "The brave ones and the foolish ones look identical from the outside. Nobody can tell which is which until it's over. So the only question is whether you're willing to be the foolish one." He picked up his coffee. "Most people aren't, not because they're cowards, because being the foolish one is genuinely terrible." "It was genuinely terrible," she agreed. "Yes," he said. "And it worked. And now everyone calls you brave." He said it without mockery, but precisely. "Next time someone stands where you stood in October 2 years ago, with nothing in a bad idea, maybe they'll remember that the brave and the foolish look the same from where you were standing and act accordingly." She sat with that. Outside, the light was going, the long gold edge of it retreating from the valley floor. "Is that what you're trying to do?" she said. "With the notebooks, with everything you're teaching me. Make something that helps the next person." He shrugged, which with Gregor was an honest answer. "What else would I do with it?" he said. "Let it die with me?" She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. They sat until the light was gone and the stars began, and then they walked back down the slope together. Him careful with the left knee, her matching his pace without making it obvious she was doing so. And in the kitchen, she reheated the soup from the afternoon, and they sat at the table and ate. And Della had left a note about the morning's pressing schedule, and the herd was settled on the lower slope, and the spring was running in the dark the way it always ran, indifferent to the season and the hour and the complete impossibility of what had come from finding it. By the 2nd December, the notebooks were finished, all of Gregor's, all of Borbala's. with Gregor's additions in the margins where her methods and his had converged or diverged, and he wanted to explain why. The complete record of everything two people had known about raising goats and making cheese in rough terrain, translated and expanded and set down in a ledger that Maris had bound properly at the bookbinder in town. She made 2 copies, one for the property, one for Gregor to keep. "You should give a copy to the agricultural college," Gregor said, looking at the bound ledger on the kitchen table. "Not for anything formal, just there should be a copy somewhere that isn't dependent on a single building not burning down." "I'll write to them in January," she said. He nodded. He picked up the ledger and looked at the cover, which she'd had stamped with both their names, G. Varga and M. Holloway, Practical Methods for Goat Husbandry and Cheese Production in Hill Country Terrain. "Bori should be on this," he said. "There's a page inside," she said. "Second page before the introduction. I put her there." He opened it, read the second page, closed it again. He didn't say anything for a minute. "Good," he said, finally. "Just that." The last day of that 2nd December was clear and cold, the kind of winter day that is brutal and beautiful in equal measure, the kind that has no softness in it, but also no dishonesty. Maris went up to the north slope in the late afternoon, alone, which she did sometimes when she needed to think, or sometimes when she just needed to be somewhere that didn't require her to be anything in particular. The spring was running at its winter rate, slightly less than summer, the flow always moderated by season, but steady, the way it was always steady, cold water from deep in the mountain coming up through stone that had been filtering it since before anyone in the valley had a name. She sat beside it for a while. She thought about the year and a half that had just passed, though thought wasn't quite the right word for it. She wasn't analyzing it, she was just letting it move through her the way things do when you let yourself stop for a minute. The $40. The 55 goats, starving and suspicious, walking up the track in October while the whole valley thought she'd lost her mind. Edmund, who had wanted this land to be something it wasn't and had loved it anyway. Gregor, who had arrived out of nowhere on a cold slope and changed everything. Cecil, who had showed up with a shovel and asked no credit for it. Della, who had told her the pressing weight was inconsistent and been right. The people in the town hall who had put in their $3 and their $2 for a water test to prove that something she'd built deserved to survive. Roy Fenwick saying I was unkind with the particular difficulty of a proud man on uncomfortable ground, and her saying okay and meaning it, mostly, in the way that you mean things when they're honest and incomplete at the same time. She was 26 years old. She had a cheese operation and a water cooperative and 63 goats, and a mortgage she was paying, and a completed ledger of knowledge that would outlast both her and Gregor, and a notebook she still hadn't titled sitting on the kitchen table with its collection of observations that were the closest thing she had to a philosophy. She was not finished. She understood that now in a way she hadn't understood when she'd started. There was no finished. There was only the work that was done and the work that came next, and the things that you learned between the two that changed the shape of what came after. She was not who she'd been in October 2 years ago. She was not who she'd been in February when she'd pressed her hand to warm ground and felt the first intimation of what was underneath. She was not who she'd been in August when she'd ridden into town in the dark with 12 pages of handwritten notes and walked into a room full of people being lied to and told the truth instead. She was the accumulation of all of those, plus the things that had happened between them that didn't have names, plus the things she'd gotten wrong and the things she'd gotten right, and the things she still didn't know yet. The spring ran beside her, cold and clear. She sat with it until the light started to fail, and then she stood up and brushed the dead grass from her skirt and looked once more at the valley below, at the flat cattle country where the creek beds were running again, at the thin smoke from the chimneys of Caldwell Crossing in the distance, at the winter light going gold and then amber, and then something that wasn't quite either. She turned around and walked back down the slope toward the house, toward the warm kitchen and the notebooks and the work that would be there in the morning, toward the life that had been built here out of $40 and 55 bad decisions that had turned out to be one very good one, on a hillside that everyone agreed was worthless, in the particular stubbornness of a woman who had decided to ask the land what it was instead of telling it what to be. Behind her, the spring kept running. It did not know it had changed anything. It had simply done what it had always done, moved through the dark, filtered through stone, come up into light when someone finally cleared away what was covering it. That was enough. That had always been enough. That was, she thought, walking down through the last of the winter light with her boots on the familiar slope, probably the thing.